My father didn't lower his voice when he said it. He leaned back in his chair, pointed straight at my children, and announced to the whole room as though he were presenting a fact, not an insult. Your mom will never make money. She'll never be anything. My 7-year-old daughter froze her lip, trembling before she burst into tears. My son lowered his eyes to his plate, shoulders curling inward. I didn't flinch. I placed my hand on my daughter's back and kept her steady. The living room television behind my father lit up at that exact moment, and the night stopped belonging to him. Christmas Eve at my parents' house in Evanston always came with the same traditions, the same toasts, and the same hierarchy. My father sat at the head of the dining table. My mother arranged dishes she spent all day preparing, and the rest of the family filled in the space around them like an audience for a show. The show usually revolved around my younger brother, Adam. He was the loud one, the promising one, the one my father claimed would carry the Redwood name into the next generation. I was the opposite in their eyes, quiet, practical. The one who never aimed high, a phrase my father used so often, it practically became my title. But tonight, the moment we sat down, he didn't even pretend to hide his favorite pastime, putting me in my place. He tapped his glass, calling for my children's attention. "Kids," he said, "let me teach you something about life. The world doesn't reward people who play small. It rewards visionaries, builders." Adam smirked, adjusting his watch like he'd been summoned on stage. My daughter wiped her cheeks with her sleeve. "Mom, did you never make anything?" That question pierced deeper than anything my father had said. She wasn't doubting me. She was trying to understand why the people who shared my last name kept treating me like a placeholder. My father kept going, as if her tears confirmed his point. "If you want to be successful," he told them, "you follow people who actually accomplish things. Your uncle built a real business, real income. Your mom?" He shrugged. "She just never figured out how to get ahead." June. My partner shifted in her seat beside me. She wasn't the type to interrupt family dynamics, but she'd sat through this routine too many times to stay neutral. "Maybe tonight isn't the time for this," she said quietly. My father didn't even look at her. "It's exactly the time. Kids need honesty." My mother hovered at the edge of the conversation, wringing her napkin, whispering, "Let's just eat." But she never pushed back. Not once. Not in my entire life. Adam finally chimed in. "Dad's just saying you gotta be ambitious, guys. Your mom's fine. She just—" He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound cruel, but he didn't find one. "Plays it safe." My son looked at me, then confused. "Is that true?" I grew up with these lines. I learned early how to let them slide off my skin, but my kids, they deserved better than to inherit the shame my father spent decades handing out like party favors. I reached for my water glass, not to drink, but to keep myself grounded. "It isn't true," I told them softly. "And tonight you'll see that." June glanced at me, recognizing something in my tone. Only she knew what had happened that afternoon. Only she knew what was scheduled to air at midnight. Only she knew that for the first time in my life, the truth wasn't something I had to fight for. It was something the world was about to show for me. My father continued as though nothing in the room had shifted. "You can't coast through life," he said loudly. "You have to prove yourself. You have to build something. You can't just drift around doing little side projects and expecting anyone to respect." He didn't finish the sentence. The giant television mounted behind him flickered. My father frowned and turned around. "Who turned that on?" No one had touched a thing. The screen brightened, then shifted into the unmistakable red border of Time magazine. The room went silent. A calm broadcast voice filled the space. "Tonight, Time magazine honors one of the most influential women shaping economic redevelopment in the Midwest." He looked at the remote, confused. "What is this?" June placed her hand on my daughter's. My son sat up straighter. My mother brought a hand to her chest. The voice continued. "The driving force behind an $18 billion land and infrastructure initiative spanning Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota." My father's head snapped toward me. "Time's Woman of the Year, Clara Redwood." My full name, clear as daylight. The family stared at the screen as the segment rolled footage from the interviews I'd filmed quietly months earlier. There was no glamour, no dramatic music, Just images of me walking properties, reviewing plans, speaking with development boards, shaking hands with county officials. Adam blinked hard as if his brain couldn't sync what he was seeing with the version of me he'd always believed in. "That's Clara," one of my aunts whispered. My mother whispered my name like a question. The broadcast continued. Redwood's work has redefined regional growth standards and is projected to influence policy for decades. Her strategies have reshaped housing, municipal planning, and land use across multiple counties. My daughter looked up at me with wide, wet eyes. "Mom, that's you." I brushed a tear off her cheek. "Yes, honey." My father stood with both hands on the table, trying to steady himself. "Clara, why didn't you tell us I kept my voice even?" "I did. Many times. You didn't listen." Adam finally spoke, his voice paper thin. "You're the one behind that project. The big redevelopment thing the news keeps talking about." "Yes," I said, "all of it." The shifting silence in that room was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, like the air itself had rearranged. My father looked from the television back to me, jaw-tight eyes confused. "You made $18 billion? "No," I corrected calmly. "The project is worth $18 billion. I oversaw the land contracts and planning. It's a public record." My daughter sat up taller, her tears drying. My son's expression sharpened with something new, pride. The broadcast ended with a final line. In recognition of her leadership, innovation, and long-term impact, Clara Redwood stands as one of the most pivotal figures in modern regional development. Black screen. Silence. No one breathed. I turned to my children. "Eat, sweetheart. We're okay." Then I faced the table, the family who had spent years deciding who I was without ever asking. "You wanted to know what I built?" I said, keeping my voice quiet but impossible to ignore. "Now you know." My father sank slowly into his chair, his certainty dissolving in front of everyone. June placed her hand over mine. My daughter leaned into my shoulder. And for the first time in my life, the room wasn't heavy on my chest. It was finally light. The people who mattered understood the truth. The people who underestimated me had corrected their view. The people who spoke loudly in the past had learned to pause. Everyone listened. Everyone adjusted. They corrected assumptions without being forced. I learned early that silence could follow me into every room. When they looked at me, they saw someone steady, predictable, and easy to overlook. They did not say this out loud, but everything they did confirmed it. When I was 10, my class held an academic awards day. I won for highest overall performance. My teacher shook my hand. She told me I was focused, consistent, and ahead of the class. I walked home carrying the certificate with both hands so it would not bend in the wind. I expected my parents to be proud, maybe even excited. I imagined my father hanging the certificate on the refrigerator the way he did when Adam earned something. When I stepped into the kitchen, my mother was cutting vegetables for dinner. I held the certificate out. "I got top marks," I said. She glanced at it for a moment. "Good," she said. "Set it down. Your brother needs to eat early. He has soccer practice." I placed it on the counter. She did not touch it again. 10 minutes later, Adam came home complaining about a low grade on a science quiz. Our father laughed. "Do not worry," he said. "You are not meant for numbers. You are meant for leadership." He clapped Adam on the back as if a low score meant nothing for someone with such natural potential. The certificate I brought home fell behind a row of cookbooks by the end of the week. That became the rhythm of our house. Adam failed upward. I succeeded quietly. If Adam achieved something small, everyone clapped. If I achieved something significant, they nodded and continued their day. I was not jealous, only confused. Praise did not motivate me, but the constant mismatch between effort and acknowledgement felt like an inaccuracy in their view. By the time I entered high school, I understood the structure clearly. My father believed Adam was destined for big accomplishments. He believed I would live a modest life and avoid risk. He said it often, usually in front of relatives. "Clara is dependable," he would say. "She will do fine. She does not push herself into complicated things." He was wrong, but he did not know he was wrong because he never asked me anything detailed. He assumed, and the assumptions shaped everything. I worked through high school saving every paycheck from a nearby market. Adam never had to work. He drove a car our parents bought for him when he turned 17. When I asked about a car, my father said, "If you want one, you can save for it. You are practical. You will manage it." I saved for 2 years and bought an old sedan with a dented door. My father looked at it and said, "This suits you. It is modest. It fits." I did not argue, but the comment stayed with me. After high school, Adam went straight to a business program. He told people he would start a company that would change the industry. He did not specify which industry. That did not matter. People believed him because he spoke with confidence and they liked the idea of someone aiming high. I attended community college while working. I studied land economics, regional planning, and public policy. No one asked about my classes. No one asked about the work I did. They assumed it was clerical. They assumed I chose the simplest path. My mother would tell neighbors I was helping with small planning tasks. She said this with a kind voice, not realizing how much she was minimizing what I was learning. It did not feel insulting. It felt inaccurate. Each time I tried to explain my work, she changed the topic to Adam's newest idea. Eventually, I stopped explaining. The more invisible I became at home, the more visible I became to people in my field. County boards hired me to assist with zoning reviews. Development groups trusted me with preliminary studies. I learned how to identify land that seemed unremarkable but held long-term potential. I learned how to read public documents thoroughly, line by line, until I understood the structure behind every policy. Adam never asked what I did. When relatives asked him, he said Clara does planning stuff. She likes small, simple work. He said this with confidence, as if he had analyzed my role thoroughly. People accepted his explanation without checking. When I turned 28, I married June and moved into a small house. We kept our expenses low and saved consistently. I worked part-time from home after our first child was born. My father believed this confirmed his assumptions. She chose stability, he told a family friend. She does not want big responsibilities. I heard that secondhand. It did not hurt. It clarified things. The truth was simpler. I liked accuracy. I liked careful planning. I liked understanding the structure of a problem before taking action. None of that meant I lacked ambition. It meant I preferred building something thoroughly instead of loudly. Over time, the gap between my actual work and what my family believed widened. The more skilled I became, the less they noticed. I did not blame them. They were not paying attention. They were focused on Adam's highs and lows, chasing every new idea he presented. He launched a startup at 30. It ran out of money in less than a year. He opened another one with a new pitch deck. My parents told everyone he was on the rise. He spent money easily because he believed the next big deal was coming. My parents covered shortfalls, convinced he needed just one more injection. I never asked them why they kept supporting him. I understood their reasoning even if I disagreed. They believed potential was more important than evidence. While Adam sought investors, I attended planning hearings, reviewed budgets, and studied long-term trends. My work was not flashy. It required patience. It required understanding roads, water lines, and property access. It required long discussions with county engineers and field teams. I discovered opportunities not because I was lucky, but because I looked closely at information most people skimmed. Once during a routine review, I found a parcel that had been labeled unproductive for decades. The soil was poor, but the location intersected with 3 future transit proposals. It was undervalued only because no one had updated the file. That parcel later became the first site of a multi-phase development. I did not mention any of this to my family. It was not a secret. It was practical. Sharing details required patience that no one in that house had ever shown. They liked simple summaries. My work did not fit in a summary. As the years passed, I built a professional network without drawing attention. County officials trusted me because I arrived prepared. Developers trusted me because I delivered accurate data. Regional committees trusted me because I did not exaggerate. I became someone people depended on quietly. By the time I turned 34, the outline of the $18 billion regional initiative was already forming. It involved multiple counties, layered contracts, and phased redevelopment that would take decades. Each part required careful alignment. Each step required precision. I became one of the people holding those pieces together. During that same period, Adam told the family he was close to a major breakthrough. He said this at every holiday dinner. My parents repeated the line to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, at those same dinners, they asked me to bring side dishes. I did not argue. I did not correct. I stayed steady because I knew the truth was not fragile. I knew the work would stand on its own. I did not need approval from people who had never taken the time to understand me. The year before everything changed, I attended a regional summit. My name appeared on official documents as an advisor for development planning. I spent 3 days in meetings discussing long-term infrastructure. The work was structured and demanding. Nothing about it was vague or modest. When I returned home, my father asked if I had fun at the conference. He assumed it was a casual event. I said it was productive. He nodded and asked how Adam's business pitch was going. That was the moment I understood fully what had been happening for years. They did not misunderstand me. They had built a fixed image of me long ago, and they did not intend to update it. But I kept working. I kept building. I kept collecting information and forming strategies. I did not rush. I did not complain. I did not attempt to convince them of anything. I moved forward one step at a time until the results became visible, even to people who had never paid attention. Nothing about the future revelation was dramatic to me. It was a natural consequence of consistent work. It was the moment when the facts I had built finally became too large to ignore. I arrived at my parents' house 2 days before Christmas because my mother insisted on a full family dinner. She liked the idea of everyone gathering under one roof, even though she avoided conversations about anything uncomfortable. When she called me earlier that week, she said she had bought new decorations and wanted the table to look perfect. I told her I would come with the kids. June had to work late that night, so I planned to go alone with them. The house looked the same as it always had. My mother arranged lights along the porch railings, and my father placed a wreath on the door. When I stepped inside, the living room smelled like roasted vegetables and pine cleaner. The television played quietly in the corner. My parents were already setting the table. My father asked if the drive was smooth. I said yes. He did not ask about my work or the projects I was finishing. He moved straight to checking the oven timer. Adam arrived 10 minutes after we did. He walked in wearing a new coat and talking loudly on the phone. He paused long enough to hug our mother and give our father a pat on the back. He did not look at me until he finished his call. When he finally said hello, he spoke as if he had not seen me in years, even though we lived only 2 towns apart. He asked if my job was still the flexible planning thing. I said yes. He nodded like he already knew the answer. My daughter Emma stayed close to me. She did not like loud rooms. My son Daniel ran off to look at the toys my parents kept for him in the den. My mother moved quickly around the kitchen checking dishes and stirring pots. She asked Adam how his business was going. He said he was in talks with partners and that things were moving fast. She smiled as if this was exactly what she hoped to hear. I helped bring dishes to the table. No one noticed. That was normal. I set down plates and arranged napkins. My father told Adam to sit at the head of the table because he wanted to hear about Adam's latest plans. He placed me at the far end of the table next to the kids. I did not comment. I had sat in that seat at every holiday meal. Dinner started with my father lifting his glass and praising Adam for his drive and vision. He said Adam was close to a breakthrough. Adam accepted the praise without apologizing for anything he had failed at that year. My mother smiled proudly at him. When my father finished speaking, everyone began eating, and the room filled with conversation. My daughter whispered that she liked the rolls but that the room was loud. I told her she could sit closer to me if she wanted. She moved her chair slightly. Adam noticed and laughed. "She is shy like you," he said. "Quiet, simple, steady." I looked at him, but he had already gone back to explaining a business plan to our father. I ate my food slowly, waiting for the evening to settle. Nothing in the atmosphere felt unusual. It felt like every Christmas meal we had ever shared. Adam talked. My parents listened. I stayed in the background. Halfway through dinner, my mother asked if I had any updates from work. She asked politely, but her tone suggested she expected a short answer. I told her I had completed a long-term review for one county and was preparing for a series of planning hearings. She nodded as if I had mentioned something routine. She asked Adam another question immediately after. Adam leaned back in his chair and launched into a description of a project he had not started yet. My father encouraged him. My mother asked if he needed help. He said he was in control. He talked for several minutes without interruption. I listened without reacting. My children watched him as if he was performing. After dessert, the room calmed down briefly. My father began collecting plates. My mother checked the stovetop. Adam put his arm around our father's shoulder and said he wanted to show him something on his phone. They stepped into the living room. I stayed near the table, wiping crumbs into a napkin. My daughter tugged on my sleeve. She asked if we could go home soon. I told her we would leave after I helped clean. She nodded. Adam returned from the living room and sat beside my children. He started asking them about school. My son answered easily. My daughter spoke quietly. Adam leaned closer and said, "You two need to study hard. Do not end up doing small tasks like your mother. She means well, but she never aimed high." My daughter looked at me. Her eyes lowered. Adam continued talking as if he was giving helpful advice. He said people only succeed if they push past average goals. He said their mother had chosen the easy path. He said if they wanted stability, they could follow her, but if they wanted success, they should look at what he was doing. I told him to stop. My voice was calm. He looked at me and laughed it off as a joke. He said he was simply teaching them ambition. My mother heard part of the exchange and told Adam not to be harsh. Adam said he was not harsh, just honest. The children stayed quiet. I gathered our coats and told them we would leave soon. My mother asked if we wanted to open gifts first. Emma shook her head. She did not want to stay. My mother looked disappointed but did not argue. Before we stepped outside, Adam made one final comment. He said it loudly enough that everyone heard. "It is fine. Clara is used to modest outcomes. Some people work small, some people work big." My father made a small gesture telling him to stop, but he did not push the point. That told me everything about the dynamic in that room. The drive home was silent. My daughter sat stiffly in her seat. My son asked a few questions, but stopped when he sensed the mood. I kept my hand steady on the wheel. I intended to address the issue in a clear, controlled way once we got home. When we walked inside, I helped the kids change into pajamas. My daughter finally asked if what Adam said was true. Her voice was quiet and tense. I told her Adam was wrong. I told her my work required real skill and responsibility. She listened, but her expression did not relax. Hurt had already settled in. I stayed with them until they fell asleep. The house was quiet, aside from the sound of the heating system turning on. I sat in the living room thinking about the dinner, not because the comments surprised me, but because of the effect I saw on my children. I was used to being underestimated. They were not. They did not understand the history behind it. They only heard someone familiar dismiss their mother. I went to my office space and turned on the light. I opened the file drawer and looked through the documents related to work I was finalizing. Those papers represented thousands of hours of effort. They represented meetings, contracts, and approvals I had secured. They represented decisions I had contributed to and commitments I had made. They represented facts. Adam's comments did not alter any of those facts, but my children did not know those details, so his words carried weight for them. I looked at the folders for a long time. The work was not flashy, but it was substantial. It would shape communities and influence decisions far beyond our family. I thought about the years of assuming no one at the family table would ever understand. That assumption held true, but the impact shifted now. My children had entered the picture. They were absorbing what they heard. I decided I would not let Adam shape their view of me or of themselves. I decided I would act on facts, not emotion. I decided I would address the problem where it started, not with a speech, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with clear information and direct action. I left my office light on for a few more minutes, then turned it off. The decision was set. The next day would not follow the usual pattern anymore. I arrived at the community center early the next morning because the regional subcommittee scheduled a review session before the holiday break. The building opened at 8. Staff members walked in carrying binders and coffee cups. I signed in at the front desk and took a seat at the long table inside the meeting room. My laptop was fully charged and my notes were organized. The room filled slowly. 3 project managers sat near the front. A transportation analyst reviewed spreadsheets across the room. A county representative from another district placed his files in the middle of the table. No one questioned my presence. They knew my name from previous work sessions. I kept my focus on the agenda packet. The meeting began with updates on road mapping and land use adjustments. Most of the discussion centered on the winter construction pause. I contributed when needed, keeping my answers direct and specific. The group moved through each item without delay. Halfway through the session, the door opened. Adam walked in wearing a jacket thrown over one shoulder. He scanned the room like he expected attention. His company was not part of the committee, but he acted as if the meeting revolved around him. He sat down across from me and nodded to the project manager next to him as if they were longtime colleagues. The project manager gave a polite but confused nod back. I asked him quietly why he was there. He said he was hoping to pitch a logistics platform he had been working on. I told him this was not a networking event. He shrugged. "I can still make connections," he said. "People need initiative." The chair of the committee resumed the meeting. Adam leaned back, crossing his arms, listening as if he belonged on the panel. When the group reached a point that involved inventory projections, he stepped in without invitation. "If you need digital tracking support, my team can help," he said. "We run a flexible system." The chair told him the discussion was pre-approved and that outside proposals required formal submission. Adam smiled as if that rule did not apply to him. I kept my attention on the report in front of me. When the next planning item came up, I answered a question about land allocation. My explanation was clear. I referenced the page number and the supporting document. Adam watched me. When I finished, he said, "Clara handles the minor reviews. She knows the small tasks well." Several heads turned toward him. The transportation analyst lowered his pen. The county representative raised an eyebrow. Adam did not notice their reactions. He continued speaking. "She has always been detail-oriented," he said. "Not built for strategic oversight, but useful for fine print." He said it lightly, but the message was direct. It was the same tone he used at our parents' house. The group stayed silent. They did not know the history, but they could hear the dismissal. I kept my hands steady on the table. The chair continued the agenda. I answered another question about corridor sequencing. Adam watched the room, carefully leaning forward as if preparing to add more commentary. When the next opportunity came, he took it. "I can explain how to streamline that," he said. "You need broader leadership thinking. Clara is more comfortable with simple structures." His voice echoed across the quiet table. One of the planners cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. The county representative folded his folder shut. The transportation analyst leaned back and stared at Adam steadily. The chair asked Adam directly if he had formal business with the subcommittee. He said no. The chair instructed him to observe without commenting. Adam nodded, although he looked irritated. The meeting moved forward. When the next action plan came up, the chair asked me to present the site access summary. I stood and walked to the front of the room. I outlined the data clearly, section by section. I referenced maps, zoning restrictions, and right-of-way factors. I kept my tone neutral. When I finished, several managers asked follow-up questions. I answered each one with the same direct clarity. As the chair thanked me and moved to the next agenda point, Adam spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "She has always been responsible," he said. "She is not a leader, but she is reliable." His comment was unnecessary. It had nothing to do with the material. It was a judgment. It implied a limitation that he believed was obvious. The chair paused and looked at him. Adam did not seem to notice the tension. The meeting wrapped up 15 minutes later. People gathered their things quickly. A few nodded to me before leaving. Their expressions were polite but awkward. The entire exchange had been visible. Adam walked beside me as I packed my laptop. "You did well," he said, as if giving encouragement to someone junior. "That is your strength. Practical tasks. You keep things organized." I told him the comments were out of place. He said he was helping. He said he did not want me to give people the wrong impression. He said I did important but modest work, and that it was better to be realistic than overconfident. His voice stayed casual, as if he believed he was protecting me from embarrassment. We walked out to the parking lot. Snow lined the edges of the pavement. My car was parked near the street. Adam followed me to it, still talking. He said people who avoid big risks stay comfortable but never leave a mark. He said I should focus on supporting roles, not complex projects. He said the group needed leaders, and not everyone was cut out for that. I unlocked my car without responding. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a call from a county commissioner confirming a later meeting. I told Adam I had to leave. He nodded like he was letting me go early. When I drove out of the lot, I looked in the rearview mirror. Adam stood near his car, tapping his phone, smiling at something on the screen. He showed no sign of concern about his behavior. He did not think he had crossed a line. He thought he had been honest. As I merged onto the main road, I replayed the morning in my mind. His behavior was consistent with everything he had done the night before. He did not question his assumptions. He did not review facts. He relied on a fixed story he had created years ago. The difference now was the setting. This was not a family dinner table. This was a professional environment. His dismissive statements were not just personal. They were public. They were heard by people who knew the work and recognized when someone misjudged it. The gap between perception and reality had reached a point that could not continue without consequences. Adam was not aware of that yet, but the results of his actions were building. When I turned into my driveway 20 minutes later, I knew the next step would come soon. It would not be emotional. It would not be dramatic. It would be a response to facts, not feelings. His words had been heard by people who understood the work better than he did, and he had made those statements in front of the wrong audience at the wrong time. He had crossed a professional boundary without knowing it. The impact was already in motion. I spent the afternoon reviewing files for a county presentation scheduled for early spring. The work required clear numbers and accurate projections. I focused on traffic flow estimates, infrastructure budgets, and long-term land use charts. When I closed the last file, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother, reminding me about the second Christmas dinner the next day. She wanted everyone together again because a few relatives were visiting from out of town. I told her I would come. That evening, after the children went to bed, I sat at the dining table reviewing my notes again. The room was quiet. The overhead light kept the table bright enough to work without straining my eyes. I paused when I reached the folder labeled 3 years ago. That was when everything had shifted for Adam, though he never acknowledged the details. He spoke about that period often, but he changed the story each time to protect his pride. The truth was simple. His company had been close to shutting down. The numbers were clear. Payroll exceeded revenue. Loan agreements were coming due. Contracts were incomplete. He had overspent on office upgrades and inexperienced hires. His accounts showed no remaining cushion. He faced the risk of default. I learned all of this through a local industry brief, not through him. He did not reach out to me. He told our parents a vague version and kept the rest hidden. When I read the report, I understood immediately what the consequences would be. The bank could claim assets. The company could close. My parents, who had co-signed one of his loans, could lose their home. They were not prepared for that. They did not have a backup plan. I requested a meeting with a legal advisor the next morning. I explained the situation plainly. I asked for the process required to purchase the failing company in a way that protected the employees, the contracts, and my parents' home. The advisor gave me a list of documents, transfer procedures, and confidentiality requirements. I followed every step. The transfer was approved. My involvement was never mentioned publicly because the agreement prevented disclosure. I did not object. I did not want attention. I only wanted stability for my parents and for the employees who would have lost their jobs. Once the documents were signed, the company had a new majority owner. It was a holding entity designed only to manage the shares. I kept it separate from my other work, so it would not distract from the regional projects I was building. I reviewed the company's finances every quarter. I approved necessary expenses and blocked wasteful spending. I authorized the hiring of a capable operations manager. I did not interfere with daily workflow. Adam believed he received a fresh investment from a group of outside backers. He thanked them loudly through social media posts. He said they recognized his vision. My parents repeated his version to their friends. I did not correct it. I was not interested in correcting it. The truth existed in documents. I did not need him to acknowledge it. That year was busy. My work expanded across county lines. I attended hearings, wrote reports, and met with planning directors. The regional initiative grew steadily. Each piece required careful coordination. No part of it was simple. I relied on consistent preparation because every detail mattered. Nothing about the workload felt dramatic. It was structured work, the kind that required organization more than charisma. During that same period, Adam rebuilt his company's public image. He spoke confidently at community events. He talked about his turnaround strategy. He told people he refused to give up. My parents believed him without question. They admired his resilience. I heard the praise at family dinners and stayed quiet. He never asked how I was doing. He never asked what projects I was involved in. When relatives asked him what I did, he said I handled small-scale planning tasks. He said it with certainty, even though he had no information beyond assumptions he formed years earlier. As the regional project expanded, my workload increased. I conducted travel surveys, analyzed land boundaries, and evaluated pre-development proposals. My name appeared on several internal reports. None of this reached my family. They had never been part of my professional world. They would not have understood the workload. They cared about Adam's updates. They never asked about mine. 2 years ago, the initiative reached a turning point when a national publication requested interviews with select contributors. The organization wanted a series of features highlighting long-term development efforts across several states. They contacted our regional committee first. My role has been consistent and measurable. The publication wanted to include me in their series. The interview took place over video. The reporter asked clear technical questions. I answered directly. She requested project documents and timelines. I sent them through the official channel. She asked about the potential long-term impact. I outlined the expected outcomes. The feature went through an internal review and was scheduled for a later release. I did not mention it to my family. The publication adjusted their release calendar occasionally. I did not expect a firm date. Last year, I received an email confirming the feature would be published in winter. I did not check the exact week. It was not a priority at the time. I did not expect it to matter during the holiday. My focus remained on the next planning review. Adam, meanwhile, spoke continuously about his breakthrough. He told our parents that his presentation to investors had gone well. He said he had potential deals lined up. He said his company was on track to expand. He did not mention the operational issues still present. He did not mention the performance inconsistencies. He managed his narrative because it protected him. My parents accepted it because they wanted him to succeed. The contrast between our realities grew wider each year. My work expanded quietly because it required precision, not publicity. His work expanded publicly because it required attention, not structure. Before closing the binder for the night, I paused at the page showing the initial acquisition documents from 3 years ago. The numbers were clear. The signatures were clear. The impact was clear. Adam's company was still operational because the paperwork here made it possible. The next day, I attended the second Christmas dinner as planned. My mother greeted me at the door and commented on how tired I looked. She assumed it was from parenting. She did not consider work. Adam arrived shortly after. He immediately began telling relatives about his newest plans. They listened closely. They asked follow-up questions. They encouraged him. I stood near the kitchen counter preparing plates for the kids. No one asked what I had been working on. No one asked about the hearings I had attended. They had never asked. They stayed consistent. Adam walked by and said he hoped I was not stretching myself because he said I worked best when things were simple. He did not mean it cruelly. He believed it. He believed his version of me was accurate. My mother called us to the table. Everyone sat. Conversation centered around Adam's updates again. No one questioned the gap between his stories and the actual results. No one checked anything. They accepted his confidence. I did not expect anything different. I knew the patterns clearly by then. But what Adam did not know was that the next part of the timeline was already in motion. It was not emotional. It was not reactive. It was factual. The publication was preparing the winter release. The timeline did not depend on him. It did not depend on our parents. It did not depend on how anyone viewed me. It depended only on the work itself. The morning after the second dinner, I woke early because I wanted to check on the children before starting work. Emma was still asleep. Daniel was awake, sorting his toy cars on the floor. The house was quiet. I made coffee and reviewed notes for an upcoming meeting. I wanted to stay focused, but thoughts from the previous night stayed in the background. My phone buzzed with a reminder from a regional coordinator about an updated schedule for January. I responded quickly. The coordinator confirmed receipt and said she would send additional documents later. Nothing in the message mentioned the upcoming publication, but I knew the feature was scheduled for release that week. I had not shared the information with anyone at home. The timing was not intentional. It simply had not come up. June came downstairs and asked about the dinner. I told her everything in direct terms. She listened and asked if I wanted her to speak with Adam. I said no. I wanted to handle the situation without adding tension. She nodded. She trusted that I had a plan, even if she did not know the details. 3 hours later, my mother called. She wanted to confirm the final Christmas dinner for the extended family that evening. She said more relatives would attend and that Adam planned to present his new business update to them. She wanted me there because it was important to show unity. I told her we would come. She thanked me and hung up. Before getting ready, I sat at my desk to review a stack of internal reports. My goal was to stay grounded in work facts, not in family dynamics. The reports covered zoning adjustments, water access updates, and future easement approvals. Each section required accuracy. I took notes calmly, one line at a time. I kept my concentration steady. The work gave me clarity because it was based on clear rules and measurable outcomes. Nothing about it depended on opinion. Around mid-afternoon, I received a message from a colleague attaching the finalized schedule for the winter publication series. She included the release times for several regions. My feature was included in the upcoming cycle. The posting time was clear. The release was scheduled for 6:30 in the evening, which was the exact time my family planned to sit down for dinner. The timing was not dramatic. It was coincidental. I looked at the clock and confirmed the alignment. I closed the message without reacting. The feature was a summary of work I had completed across several counties. It included factual data, contract histories, and expected development outcomes. The subject matter was straightforward. There was no commentary on my life or my family. I finished reviewing my files, made dinner preparations for the kids, and checked with June about timing. She said she would meet us at my parents' house after work. I loaded the children into the car and drove toward the neighborhood where I grew up. Traffic was steady. The roads were clear. Nothing about the drive felt unusual. When we arrived, the driveway was full. I parked near the curb and helped the kids gather their things. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She told me everyone was already inside the living room. I hung our coats and led the children to the gathering. The house was louder than usual. Several relatives I had not seen since last year were seated on the couches. Adam stood in the center of the room, telling a story about a recent conference he attended. He described it with enthusiasm. He used terms that sounded impressive, but did not match the actual structure of business operations. People listened because he delivered the story confidently. My father motioned for me to sit on the chair near the wall. I did. The children sat beside me. No one asked how work was going. No one asked about the hearings I had attended. They moved straight to Adam's updates. He described his future plans. He talked about potential growth. He said his company was ready to expand aggressively. Several relatives asked follow-up questions. He answered each one as though he had a firm plan. He did not mention debt. He did not mention the operational issues that still needed correction. He did not mention the original bailout. He focused on the version of himself he preferred. Dinner was served at 6:20. We sat around the long table. Conversations overlapped. My mother asked Adam if he wanted to say a few words about his upcoming year. He stood and spoke to the whole table. He talked about risks, leadership, and ambition. He said people who aimed too small limited themselves. He said comfort was the enemy of progress. Some relatives nodded and agreed. They liked the motivation in his voice. He continued speaking until he noticed I had not reacted. He looked at me directly. Then he addressed the table and said, people who avoided large goals often settled into support roles and stayed quiet because they did not want to fail. The table grew still. He did not say my name, but he did not need to. Everyone understood the implication. He kept speaking. He said, ambition required visibility. He said leadership required volume. He said some people worked small because they preferred safety. I looked at him without emotion. My daughter looked at me and waited to see how I would respond. I did not interrupt him. I let him continue because responding directly would not have changed anything. He had built his understanding of me years ago and had no interest in revising it. At 6:30, phones around the room buzzed with notifications. Several relatives glanced down. One of them, my aunt, tapped her screen and froze. She nudged the person next to her. Another phone lit up, then another. Within seconds, half the table was looking at the same headline. My name appeared clearly in the center of the screen. The publication released the winter feature on time. The title listed the regional initiative, the budget scale, and the names of contributors. My photograph appeared beside the summary. The feature described the project phases, explained my role, and listed the total estimated investment value for the next several decades. No part of it was exaggerated. Everything came from verified documents and measurable data. A relative across the table read the headline aloud. The room quieted. Forks stopped moving. Someone scrolled and read another line. They looked at me, then back at the screen. My father leaned closer to my mother and whispered something. She did not respond. Adam was still standing. His expression did not change at first. He attempted to continue his point, but no one was listening. More phones lit up. The publication appeared on the front page of multiple feeds because the story was part of a national series. Someone asked, "Is this the same project you have been working on all year?" I said yes. Another asked, "You are responsible for this." I said, "I contributed to the planning and coordination." The data in the feature was accurate. My aunt read aloud a line describing the significance of the development plan. She repeated the number twice because she thought she had misread it. The room remained silent. People looked at me with a mixture of confusion and recalibrated perception. My daughter looked at me with a steady expression. She did not look surprised. She looked relieved. Adam lowered his hand slowly. He looked at the screen in front of the relative next to him. He read the headline twice. Then he looked at me. He did not speak. No one asked him to continue his speech. No one asked him to explain anything. The conversation shifted entirely. People asked how long I had been working on the initiative. They asked how I managed the workload. They asked what the timeline looked like for future phases. They asked questions they had never asked before. I answered calmly. I spoke clearly. I kept the information factual. Nothing in my tone changed. Adam sat down. He stayed quiet. He looked at his hands and did not rejoin the discussion. For the first time in years, the entire room viewed the situation differently. The shift did not come from anything I said. It came from documented work made public at the exact moment he attempted to define me again. The reaction did not require emotion. The facts were enough. I stepped into the kitchen to refill water for the children because the room needed a moment to settle after the publication alert. The relatives were still reading the article at the table. Their voices dropped to quiet interruptions as they confirmed details with each other. None of them had expected the information, and they were still processing it. I did not need to watch their reactions. I focused on the glass pitcher in my hands. When I returned to the dining room, Adam stood near the doorway. He blocked the entrance slightly as if waiting for me. His posture was stiff. His expression was flat. He looked like someone who had questions, but did not know how to form them. The room went silent when he stepped forward. He asked me in a controlled tone what the publication meant. His voice was calm on the surface, but his eyes showed tension. He asked if the project listed under my name was real. He asked how long I had known about the release. He asked why I had never mentioned it. His tone was not angry at first. It was tight, restrained. He wanted clarity. He wanted the article to be incorrect or incomplete. He wanted a simple explanation that would make everything fit the version of me he had always believed. I answered each question directly. The project was real. The numbers were correct. The release date had been scheduled for months. I did not mention it because it was part of official work, not personal conversation. He asked if the article exaggerated my role. I told him it did not. He asked if someone had mistaken me for another contributor. I told him the reporter had verified every detail. People at the table turned to listen. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others kept scrolling through the article silently. Adam took a shallow breath. His voice sharpened. He said the work described in the article was not small planning tasks. He said it was large-scale development. He said the numbers were too high. He said he would have known if I was involved in something that significant. One of the relatives asked him why he would have known. Adam did not answer. He looked at them briefly, then looked back at me. He stepped closer. He said, I should have told the family if I was involved in something important. He said withholding that information made things misleading. He said he did not understand why I had not kept them updated. I told him no one had ever asked. The table stayed quiet. No one contradicted me. Everyone knew the pattern was consistent across the years. Adam's expression changed. His jaw tightened. He said I should not act as if I had been ignored. He said the family cared about me. He said I could have shared if I wanted to. I responded calmly. I told him the family supported him because he volunteered information constantly. I told him I had been steady and private about my work because that was how the work functioned. I told him the lack of communication came from assumptions, not exclusion. He exhaled sharply. He looked around the room as if checking for support. Most of the relatives avoided eye contact. A few looked uncomfortable. No one stepped in to defend him. He turned back to me and said he felt blindsided. I told him the article was not about him. It was about a regional project that required accuracy. He said accuracy was not the issue. He said the shock came from the scale. He said the numbers did not match who you are. He said I should have been open about the scope. I told him the numbers matched the work. I told him nothing had changed except his awareness of it. A relative near the end of the table asked Adam to sit down. He refused. He said the conversation was necessary. He said the room needed clarity. He said he wanted to understand why I had chosen to hide large achievements. I repeated the same point no one had asked. He stepped even closer. His voice rose. He said if I had been working at that scale, then why had I never once contributed anything to his business discussions? He said my limited planning background did not match the project described. He questioned the reporter's evaluation. He questioned the committee's recognition. He questioned whether the article reflected the full truth. He wanted the article to be the mistake, not his long-standing assumptions about me. I stayed calm. I adjusted the chair beside me and told the children to sit comfortably. Daniel leaned against the armrest. Emma kept her eyes on me, waiting. Adam pressed harder. He asked how I had been involved in development work for so long without anyone in the family knowing. I said I had been consistent, but consistency was not dramatic. He said he needed more detail. He said he wanted to know exactly when the work had become this big. His tone shifted again. He became frustrated, not angry at first, confused. He asked why I had not corrected him during the many years he described me as simple, cautious, and small scale. He said I could have told him the truth. I told him I did not correct people unless the information affected the outcome. I told him his assumptions did not change my workload. I told him his comments had not interfered with the regional planning process. I told him his misunderstanding did not change the results. He grew louder, asking if I had avoided telling him because I thought he would take credit, or if I assumed he would ruin things. He paused at the word trust. Someone at the table whispered that he should sit. He ignored them. He asked if the work was the reason I did not seek his business advice. I told him I did not need his business advice. He blinked hard at that. He took a step back, then stepped forward again. His frustration shifted into something sharper. He asked who had nominated me for the feature. I said the committee submitted the list. He asked what qualified me for it. I said my work history did. He asked why the publication noted my decision-making involvement. I said the documentation verified it. He asked if I believed the work made me more accomplished than he was. I told him the work was not a comparison. It was factual. It had measurable outcomes. It would continue with or without recognition. He asked again why I had kept quiet for years. His voice cracked slightly. The room remained silent. I answered with the same tone I had used all evening. I said I did not stay quiet. I stayed focused. I said the family had never asked about the details, so the details never appeared in the house. I said he had built a clear picture of me years ago, and nothing outside that picture had his attention. He absorbed the words, but did not respond. He looked around the room again. No one stepped in. Several relatives looked at the table. One cleared her throat. Another folded his napkin. The silence made the difference clear. He understood for the first time that the years of assumptions were visible to everyone in the room. He understood that he had not asked questions. He understood that he had dismissed information he had never bothered to gather. He understood that the gap between us was built from actions, not from personality. He swallowed hard, then asked one final question. "Who exactly do you meet with for this project?" I listed the departments and committees plainly. I listed counties, directors, planners, and development boards. I listed partnerships across districts. I listed the responsibilities confirmed in the published summary. His expression collapsed, not dramatically, simply and visibly. He stepped back from the doorway, moved around the table, and sat in the empty chair. He looked down at his hands, and he did not speak again. The confrontation ended because the facts ended it. No one defended him. No one corrected the article. No one questioned the numbers. The room understood what had happened, and so did he. The image he had held for years no longer matched reality. The facts held. The room stayed silent long enough for Adam to think the confrontation had ended, but my cousin Harold broke the stillness by asking if the article meant I would move to another state. He asked it casually, but everyone turned toward me. The timing was awkward. Adam lifted his head fast as if he heard a threat. June looked uncomfortable, and she placed her hand on her phone as if preparing for another alert. I told Harold there was no relocation planned. The work allowed flexible presence across counties. He nodded and said he was only curious. The tension in the room did not lift. Several relatives kept glancing between Adam and me. They were waiting for the next shift. It came from Adam's chair. He stood again, slower this time. He said he was not done. His voice was lower than before, but the irritation had returned. He said the article placed the family in an uncomfortable position. Relatives, he argued, might think he misrepresented our family income, and he found the publication's timing looked intentional. He noted it was odd that the feature appeared during Christmas dinner. I told him I did not choose the timing. He found that hard to believe because major releases usually came with advance notice. I reminded him that I already told him I had known about the release date for months, but I had not connected it to the holiday. He said that explanation sounded careless. Several relatives exchanged quick looks. They saw the shift. His confusion had turned into irritation, and the irritation slid into blame. He walked around the table, speaking to the room instead of me saying he had always supported the family's reputation, kept everyone informed, and tried to bring pride to the house. He claimed the article completely altered expectations and made the holiday uncomfortable. He stopped beside the Christmas tree. The lights reflected on his face, but there was no warmth in his expression. He said he did not appreciate feeling trapped in someone else's secret. I asked what made him feel trapped. He said the publication forced him to answer questions about something he had not known. People in the family, he worried, would wonder why he had not been informed, adding it made him look detached. I replied that he did not know because he had never asked about my work. His jaw tensed. He told the room that he had always taken an interest in the family. He said he asked me how my job was every holiday. I told him he asked out of habit, not curiosity, and he cut me off by raising his hand. He said my phrasing made him sound shallow. I did not respond. He turned to the relatives and said he had always been transparent about his business. He said he updated them about every expansion. He said he kept them in the loop because that was what the family did. He said it was strange that I chose secrecy. Aunt Margaret asked him what secrecy he was referring to. He said my professional identity. She said a job was not a secret just because it was not announced. He did not respond. She added that he was confusing privacy with deception. He looked at her but did not argue. The room quieted again. Then he shifted angles. He said if I had known I was about to be featured in a national publication, then I should have prepared the family so they would not be caught off guard. He said the presence of children made the timing worse. Emma and Daniel, he suggested, were too young to understand the article, and the attention-arguing responsible parents avoided situations that created unnecessary confusion for kids. His statement made two people sit up straighter. June glared at the table. My cousin Stephen leaned back sharply as if waiting for a reaction. I asked him to explain what he meant by responsible. He said the spotlight could confuse children. Sudden attention, he claimed, could create pressure. He said presenting information this way made things chaotic for everyone. I answered calmly. I told him I did not present anything. I reminded him the article arrived because he insulted me in front of my children, and my phone lit up with the publication notification in response. Had he not shouted his prediction that I would never be anything, the discovery would have remained quiet until after the holiday. He said I was twisting the timeline. I said the timeline was documented. He pressed on. He said I should not have opened the article in front of the family. He should have waited until later, he insisted, claiming seeing the information immediately created a scene. I reminded him that he had spoken loudly enough that the entire table heard his insult. He looked irritated, but did not deny it. He moved another step toward me. He kept his hands at his sides, but his posture was confrontational. I told him the work was not dramatic. It was logistical planning, funding, allocation, zoning, environmental review, and coordination across departments. He said the details were unnecessary. He said people cared more about character than job description. He said I had embarrassed him. The room reacted at once. Several relatives looked at each other. His mother pressed her palm to her forehead. His father sighed. I asked how the article embarrassed him. He said it made him look ignorant. He argued no one should learn about a family member's major achievements through a public release. He said it undermined his perception of our relationship. He said it made him question what else he did not know. He said it made him feel small. He said the last line slowly. Not loud, but loud enough. I did not speak for several seconds. The room listened. I asked if that feeling reminded him of anything he said earlier in the evening. His eyes shifted. He did not answer. I continued. I said the way he felt was the same way he made my daughter feel. He looked at the floor. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mother spoke. She said she had seen Emma cry. She said the comment had been harsh. She said he should not have said it. He closed his eyes briefly. He told her he had been joking. She said it did not sound like a joke. He looked back at me. His frustration returned. He said I could have corrected the situation without making him look like a fool. He said I could have protected him from the surprise. He said I could have pulled him aside quietly. I told him I had done nothing. The article delivered its own information. He said my lack of warning felt intentional. I told him I did not manage his reactions. He grew louder again. He suggested I should have kept things simple, arguing the dinner was not the right place for a reveal. He felt I was being inconsiderate to the older relatives, claiming sudden surprises caused stress, and the article created unnecessary tension. His tone became accusatory. He said I should not act superior. He said success did not give me authority. He said the publication did not change the structure of the family. He said the family had always seen me as level-headed, not assertive. He said this moment was out of character. I told him the moment only seemed out of character because he had not noticed the rest of the character. He froze. He stared at me. His breathing grew shallow. His father spoke quietly, asking him to sit. He refused again. He said the conversation needed clarity. He said he wanted honesty. He said he wanted to know why I did not trust him enough to tell him anything significant. He pushed harder. He said withholding information was manipulative. He said I had created a power imbalance. He said it seemed like I had been waiting for a moment to surprise everyone. This time, 2 relatives corrected him. One said the accusation was unfair. Another said the logic did not fit the situation. He ignored them. He pointed at my chair and said the publication changed the holiday in a way he did not approve of. He said the family had come for dinner, not revelations. He said Emma and Daniel should not see adult conflicts. He said I was responsible for the disruption. I reminded him again that the disruption began with his insult. He said the insult was unrelated to the article. I told him they were part of the same pattern. He exhaled hard. He asked the room if anyone agreed with him. No one answered. The silence lasted too long for him to pretend it was neutral. He looked at me again, and I saw something shift in his expression. It was not understandable, not acceptance. It was the realization that the room no longer supported his version of the story. He lowered his voice. He said he did not want the family to think he depended on me. He said he did not want them thinking I had outgrown him. He said he did not want his children comparing him to me. He said the article made him feel like he was losing control. The honesty surprised the room. It changed the atmosphere instantly. I told him I was not responsible for his sense of control. He looked down again. The room stayed quiet for several long seconds. Then he sat. He did not speak for the rest of the evening. The relatives did not comfort him. June stayed by the children. The atmosphere steadied. People resumed their conversations, but they stayed cautious. The conflict had settled, but not because he accepted the truth. It settled because the truth no longer needed permission to exist. The conversation in the room had softened, but the tension still hovered beneath it. No one invited Adam back into the discussion. No one defended him. People spoke quietly and kept glancing toward me, unsure what to say next. I stayed at the table with Emma and Daniel until they finished their dessert. When I stood to take the plates to the kitchen, my Aunt Linda asked if the article meant I would move out of the county. Her tone was calm and direct. Two relatives leaned in to listen. Even Adam looked up. I explained the work the same way I would in a meeting. The planning stretched across several counties, the board involved multiple districts, and the scale had nothing to do with where I lived. Linda listened carefully. She said she was surprised someone from our area received that level of authority and asked how the appointment happened. I told her it came from years of smaller roles, documented results, and a process that did not move quickly. The article did not change the timeline, it only made it visible. She nodded and said she wished she had known. She admitted she would have talked to me differently if she had understood the work. Adam heard her clearly. His jaw tightened. My Uncle Paul then asked if the role changed my income. He asked it without hesitation, the same way he always asked practical questions. I told him, yes, the earnings were higher, and no, I had not discussed it because money was never part of family conversations. He accepted the answer immediately. A cousin asked how I learned to handle projects of that size. The financial details in the article had surprised her. I told her the same thing I tell new staff members. You learn step by step, and volume becomes manageable when you work with it long enough. People listened. No one interrupted. Then Stephen asked about the ring mentioned in the article. He wanted to know whether it was symbolic or tied to an official agreement. His question shifted the attention again. Adam's head came up fast. I told Stephen the ring was real but not a luxury item. It was issued as part of a board approval used for documentation and public record events. It marked a funding milestone, nothing more. The relatives absorbed that explanation with interest, not shock. Stephen asked if it was expensive. I told him its value came from what it represented, not the materials. Adam did not accept any of it. He stood and claimed the article exaggerated the details. He said national features often added dramatic elements and told me to clarify the real significance. I said everything could be verified. He insisted he needed proof, saying the family deserved accuracy. I picked up my bag, took out the secured case and set it on the table. I opened it. The ring and certification card were inside exactly as issued. The card showed the agreement identification, the board's stamp, the funding verification code, and my name. Everyone leaned in to read. Adam did not touch anything. He stared at the card, reading it more than once. His expression flattened, but his breathing changed. Linda commented quietly that she had never seen a board-issued emblem before. Paul said the stamp looked legitimate. Another relative mentioned the contract size and explained why the article sounded formal. Adam stayed silent. I closed the case and placed it beside me. The room adjusted quickly. They began asking about the approval process, the planning phases, and the length of the project. They wanted clarity, not reassurance. I answered each question the same way I would at work, concise and factual. Someone asked how long I had been preparing for the role. I said 9 years. Someone else asked how I balanced it with the children. I said structure made it possible. Another relative asked whether the role required me to work alone. I explained the teams involved. No one questioned the legitimacy again. Adam finally spoke. He did not argue this time. He asked why the family had never seen signs of my work. He mentioned my simple clothes, my routines, the balance between home and work. He said nothing about me that matched what he had read. I told him the work required focus, not display. He asked why I never showed capability at this scale. I told him he never looked for it. He stared at me without speaking. Then he admitted the truth. He felt foolish. The gap between the version of me in his head and the reality in front of him made him look uninformed. He said he felt exposed. I told him nothing about the family dynamic, changed only the awareness. He absorbed the words slowly. Then he walked to a chair near the window and sat down. He kept his eyes on the floor, not angry, not defensive, just shaken. No one asked him anything. The relatives' attention shifted to me without hesitation. Their questions centered on the project, the documentation, and the oversight. The room recalibrated around the new information. Adam watched that happen. He stayed silent for the rest of the evening. His narrative had ended. The truth had taken its place. The room changed after the certification was shown. Conversations slowed and sharpened. People asked direct questions about the project instead of making assumptions. Their tone stayed controlled, respectful. No one tried to pull Adam back into the discussion. He remained near the window, shoulders tight, avoiding eye contact. The silence around him was deliberate. The family had shifted their attention elsewhere. Questions came in steady order. Linda wanted to know how often I traveled across counties. I explained the quarterly schedule. Paul asked about budget approvals. I gave the baseline timeline and he accepted it. They listened as if piecing together a structure they had never seen clearly before. Across the room, June stood with Daniel leaning against her. She tracked the conversation quietly, stepping in only when necessary to keep the children calm. A cousin asked how long I had kept detailed documentation. Another asked how responsibilities were assigned by the board. I answered each question plainly. The room moved from confusion to curiosity, and the curiosity was sincere. Margaret then asked whether it bothered me that recognition had to come through a publication. She wondered if the reactions at the table reminded me of past years. Her tone carried no accusation, just awareness. I said I never expected anyone to follow my work closely. Some moments had felt dismissive, but none were new. She apologized for the assumptions she had made, saying she should have asked more questions. Several relatives agreed. Adam heard everything. He lifted his head. The confusion was still there, but something heavier settled behind it. Realization, not anger. Paul commented that quiet people often get overlooked. He said the situation made that visible, and added that the recognition was deserved. Others nodded. Adam reacted differently. He stepped forward and admitted he understood the project's scale and the legitimacy of the work, but the shift in the room unsettled him. He said he felt displaced, pushed out of a position he did not realize he had held. The room stilled. I told him the conversation was not about hierarchy. It was about understanding. He disagreed. He said the attention on me made him feel reduced. Someone near the table whispered that the balance had been off for years. He heard it immediately. His face tightened. He defended himself, insisting he was not responsible for everyone's misunderstandings. I clarified that no one had placed all responsibility on him, but his choices had influenced the dynamic. It was not a competition. He said it felt like one. He explained the feeling the article made him appear inadequate. It made me look accomplished and made him feel diminished. He said the shift happened too fast to process. I told him the recognition did not erase anything he had done. His reaction came from new information, not lost value. He said my calm tone made the difference feel larger. I did not respond. The silence answered for itself. Linda stepped in gently, telling him no one was competing with him. The frustration, she said, would ease when he stopped comparing. Harold added that comparison was a choice. Adam did not answer. The tension grew heavier, and the children stayed close. Then June stepped forward. She told the room the children did not need this level of conflict, especially during a holiday. She said the tension had already reached its limit. Turning to Adam, she reminded him that everything began with his comment from earlier, and that the room had been steady until he reopened the confrontation. Her tone was firm but controlled. Adam looked stunned. She continued. Feeling overwhelmed, she said, did not justify dragging the entire family back into conflict. The issue was not the article, but his reaction to the change. He stayed silent. She returned to the sofa with Daniel, and the room shifted again, this time in a way that settled things. The conflict no longer centered on information. It centered on adjustment. The article had not caused the tension. The collision between assumption and fact had. Small conversations restarted. A few people gathered coats, others moved to the kitchen. The noise softened until the atmosphere returned to something stable. Adam stayed where he was staring at the Christmas tree. His posture remained rigid, but the anger had drained. Conflict had given way to discomfort, and discomfort had settled into reflection. Relatives thanked me before leaving. They said they were proud. They apologized for earlier reactions. I acknowledged each comment without adding anything unnecessary. When the house was nearly empty, June and I cleared dishes. She worked quietly until saying she was sorry I had carried the weight of the evening alone. I told her I handled what needed handling. Adam lingered near the window until the final minutes of the cleanup. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He said he needed time to think. He said he did not want the conversation to define the future and would reach out later. I told him that was fine. He put on his coat, stepped outside, and closed the door without looking back. The night ended without shouting or resentment. It ended with clarity. The dynamic had shifted. The awareness had caught up to the facts. And the version of me that had lived in other people's assumptions no longer existed in the room. The house felt quieter after the last relatives left. The tree lights stayed on, but the room no longer carried the noise of overlapping conversations. Emma and Daniel sat on the sofa watching the remaining cookies on the table. June collected plates from the dining room. She said the evening had been heavier than expected. Christmas was supposed to be simple, she noted, hoping the children were not overwhelmed. I told her the children understood more than we assumed. Daniel walked into the kitchen. He asked if everything was finished, meaning the arguing. I told him the conversations were done for the night. He accepted the answer and helped wipe the counter. Emma sat near the counter and asked if Adam was still mad. I told her he was confused, and she nodded slowly. The children asked if we could leave early. I told them we would stay a little longer to pack up, and they accepted the explanation. I gathered the last stack of dishes. June dried them. She said she had never seen a family dynamic shift that sharply adding the change felt permanent. My mother approached me first. She said the evening had been difficult, and she was not prepared for the details in the article. She asked if Adam would recover from the embarrassment. I said he would adjust. She hesitated, then said she regretted the years she underestimated me, apologizing if she contributed to the assumption that I did not do important work. Her voice sounded deliberate, not dramatic. My father stepped closer. He said he was surprised by the scale of the project, acknowledging the results were impressive. He nodded once firmly. They accepted my offer to explain what was necessary at another time. They did not try to excuse Adam's behavior or defend his frustration. They simply acknowledged the shift and then went upstairs. I moved through the living room, gathering the last ornaments. The stillness felt manageable. I sat in the same chair I had used earlier. The room looked different now. The article had not created the change. It had revealed the reality that had existed quietly in the background. 10 minutes passed before my phone buzzed with messages from Harold, Linda, and Stephen, all thanking me for the clarity and expressing respect for the work. I answered each directly and briefly. When the doorbell rang, Adam stood on the porch. His shoulders were lowered. His arms were not crossed. He looked smaller. Walking into the living room, he glanced at the sofa and table. He needed to say something before the day ended, admitting the evening had affected him more than he expected, and that frustration had controlled him. Adam did not want that to be his final impression of the night. He recognized the shift in the family, realizing I had done the work with discipline and patience, and should have noticed earlier. He paused, took a deep breath, and then spoke. The article, he said, had shaken him because it showed a side of me he never allowed himself to consider, adding that it was not the publication's fault, but his own. His apology was clear, not loud, not forced. He was sorry. He admitted he acted out of insecurity, not logic, and was not proud of it. I let his words sit in the silence. I told him I appreciated the apology, but he had more work to do, and that changes would take time. He understood and was willing. Adam wanted a chance to rebuild trust with me and the children and would not rush the process. I told him to start by giving the situation space over the next few days. He confirmed he would not reach out until I initiated a conversation. Stepping back toward the door, he said he hoped the evening would not define our relationship permanently. I said I did not need it to. He nodded. He opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The house was quiet again, only clarity remained, and the first signs of change that did not require noise to take hold. The morning after Christmas was quiet, and the street outside was covered with a thin layer of snow that no one had driven across yet. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The calm did not feel temporary. It felt like everything had finally settled into a place that made sense. June texted to say the kids had slept well. They were eating breakfast and wanted to play in the snow later, she said. I told her I would pick them up soon. Nothing in the kitchen looked different when I finished my coffee, but the atmosphere had shifted. No tension, no expectation that someone would ask me to explain myself, no weight in the air. It was the first time in a long time the room felt neutral. I cleaned up and left to get the kids. The drive to June's house took about 15 minutes. A few joggers were out, but the roads were mostly empty. Snow fell lightly and collected on the windshield without affecting visibility. She opened the door as soon as I knocked. She said she had been thinking about last night and hoped the change would last. I told her changes like that do not fade quickly. She agreed and said the kids needed stability more than anything. Emma and Daniel came downstairs in their jackets and boots. Emma hugged me immediately. Daniel asked if he could play outside before going home. June handed them gloves and reminded them not to stay out too long. Running into the yard as soon as we got home, they built a small snowman. I watched them from the porch. Their voices were light. They were not carrying anything from last night. Emma asked if Adam would visit. I said he would not. She asked if he was upset. I said he was working through the situation. She did not ask anything else. Daniel asked why everyone looked so surprised at dinner. I told him they learned something new about me. He asked why they had not known earlier. I said no one had asked. He accepted the answer and kept packing snow. We went inside after an hour. They changed into warm clothes. I made lunch. They set the table and argued briefly about who would place the forks. The house felt normal again. Later in the afternoon, my mother called. She had talked to Adam, admitting he had contributed to the conflict and understood the impact of his words. He planned to keep some distance for a few days, she added. I told her I appreciated the update. She wanted the family to move forward without repeating old patterns. I sat at my desk after the call and opened the project folder. The board had sent a summary of the publication traffic and a list of outreach plans for January. I reviewed the information and updated my notes. Nothing about the work felt different, just because the family now understood it. That was reassuring. The kids spent the afternoon drawing pictures of snowmen. They taped them to the refrigerator. Emma drew a picture of the dinner table from the night before. She included the relatives, the tree, the table, and Adam sitting by the window. She handed it to me without explanation. The expressions she drew were neutral. No one looked angry. It was her way of moving forward. By evening, the house was steady. The kids played in the living room while I cooked dinner. The calm did not feel fragile. It felt earned. After dinner, we sat in the living room together. They read books quietly. The stability in the room made everything feel more grounded. That was what they needed. When I put them to bed, Emma asked if things would stay calm. I told her I would make sure they did. She hugged me and fell asleep quickly. Daniel followed a few minutes later. I returned to the living room, turned on a small lamp, and sat at the table. The last 24 hours replayed clearly. The dynamic in the family had shifted in a way that would not reverse. The truth had been seen. People adjusted. No one could return to the version of me they created years ago. Adam's apology had been sincere. It gave us a place to start from. I did not want revenge. I did not want to hold anything over his head. I only wanted clarity and long-term calm for the kids. The publication mattered, but the shift afterward mattered more. By the time the house was dark, except for the lamp on the table, the balance felt real. The kids were upstairs sleeping. The day had been quiet from start to finish. The future looked manageable. Before turning off the lamp, I thought about the years ahead. More conversations would come, more adjustments would happen. But the foundation was stronger than it had ever been. The people who mattered understood the truth. The ones who underestimated me had corrected their view. The ones who used volume and confidence to define others finally saw the limits of that approach. And my children had watched me stay steady without raising my voice once.